Okay, we're going to start our program, so I'm going to ask our speakers to come up. So if Carole Brown, who's the Chief Financial Officer for the City of Chicago, would join us. Bill Daley, the Manager, Partner, and Head of U.S. Operations. Woman that I have dinner with several nights a week. The last week it was at the Hideout. Amanda Vinicky of WTTW. And the President of the Civic Federation of Chicago, Laurence Msall. The future of education funding in Illinois is our topic today. And since this is such a crucial subject and we have such interesting speakers, rather than tell you about their backgrounds and all that, because I think these are people who many of us are familiar with, we would begin the program. And we'd like to start off by asking each person, starting with Carole Brown, to address the question of, is there a future for education funding in the state of Illinois? Carole, would you get us started?
Sure. Well, first I'd say it's troubling to me that anybody would laugh at that question because education is a constitutional right, and there is nothing more important than providing a quality, access to quality education, not only to the students of Illinois, but to the students of this country. So it's not a funny question. And I don't understand why people aren't more outraged by the state of funding for education in the state, not just for K through 12, but what a lack of state budget has done to our higher ed system. And I'm the first one to make light of, what government does and how government does what it does. But this isn't funny. We are in a crisis, and we are in a crisis that whether you send your kids to public school or not, that you should be outraged by. And I think what's lost on people are the gains that Chicago Public Schools has made in the time since 2011, the academic gains since the mayor went down to Springfield, got a longer school year, a longer school day. I don't think people know that Chicago Public Schools 8th graders lead this country in math gains. Our 4th graders lead the country in reading gains. I don't think that people understand that Chicago Public Schools graduation rate has improved every year since the mayor took office, that we now have more kids in IB program than any other school system in North America, and that we continue to make really strong academic gains that are now in peril because of the fact that the state won't fund education fairly. I know with this panel we're going to get into what's going on in the state and the inequity in education for CPS on the pension side and on the operational side, so I'm not going to use that for my remarks. What I'll use my remarks for is to say we are making real gains in academics, and that's what you want. You want to prepare the next generation of kids to get into a good school, to prepare them for a vocation, and that's exactly what Chicago Public Schools is doing in spite of the fact that it is not fairly funded by their state government. And that's what you should be worried about if we lose on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Laurence Msall, and let me just throw out a question at you, Laurence. I know you have your remarks, but about a year ago, the governor of the state, Governor Rauner, said it might be wise for the CPS system to declare bankruptcy. Is this a viable option, and how do you see this funding situation, not only in Chicago, but throughout the state?
Thank you. The idea that we would allow our largest school district, which is really one of the top 3 largest governments in Illinois, to file for bankruptcy does not fully recognize what the implications of bankruptcy would be. Not just for the Chicago Public Schools, but for all the surrounding units of government. Illinois does not have a clear path for municipalities or school districts to file for bankruptcy protection. And it's important to know that municipal bankruptcy is not the same as corporate bankruptcy in terms of the impact and how it operates. There have been very few municipal bankruptcies in this country, and even fewer school districts that have sought bankruptcy protection. It is allowed under federal law. However, the experience in almost every school district in every municipality, many in California, which have easier access or a more straightforward path to bankruptcy, is that those governments, which must continue to operate while they're seeking reorganization, end up costing their taxpayers more money and reducing the kind of services. Vallejo, California is a recent municipal bankruptcy. What we found in Vallejo is that when forced into bankruptcy because they could not reach consensus with their firemen in terms of their compensation and rate of growth, when they ended up in bankruptcy, the quality of services in Vallejo dropped dramatically, the taxes went up, and businesses and residents left that district, that municipality. It is not a good option for the Chicago Public Schools. It's not a good option for the state of Illinois to have all of this uncertainty related to the financial stability of our largest school districts and many other districts. It's not just Chicago that is facing a financial crisis in its school districts. The state has not had a budget for now, this will be the third year, if the General Assembly does and the governor don't reach consensus in the next 2 weeks, that we will have gone without a budget. No other state has tried this great experiment to see what happens if you operate without a budget. Those 49 other states didn't need to see what the cost would be to Illinois to know they didn't want to do it. It is enormously expensive. We're spending literally billions of dollars of money we don't have. Not having a budget is not the same thing as saving money, as not spending money. Not having a budget means we're just not managing our expenditures. Because of court orders, because of consent decrees, because of as well as a state court order that all of the state employees continue to get paid, because of the decision that was backed into, I believe, if you go back 2 years ago, when the Illinois General Assembly sent to the governor appropriations for school aid funding, which was exactly as the governor had introduced it, and much to the surprise of the people that I talked to in Springfield, the governor signed it. That, I believe, was not a well-thought-out plan. Because when we decided to say we're going to fund elementary and secondary education, but not fund mental health services, not fund higher education, we took a lot of pressure out of the room that those 49 other states that all face the same type of pressures every year. How do you manage limited resources with overwhelming obligations or feelings of need to address problems? You do it by compromise, and you create that compromise by creating a sense of urgency at the end of every legislative session that if we don't have a budget, the schools aren't going to open. If we don't have a budget, the prisons aren't going to be staffed. The state employees aren't going to be paid. So it's a terrible thing to not have a budget, and people move to the middle and compromise. We haven't done that. We're now, as you know, the governor is going to deliver his pre-special session speech tonight, hopefully bringing everyone together, calling the legislature back into session to try to put together, hopefully, a budget. It's essential for anybody who cares about the state of Illinois that we get a budget. Not a partial budget, not a stopgap, or any of the other terms of art, which are really just accounting gimmicks that Illinois has perfected instead of dealing with the overwhelming need to balance your expenses versus against your available revenue. If we try a stopgap, it's not going to work this time, is what we're told by not just the city of Chicago and the Chicago Public Schools, which urgently need assistance from the state so that they can open in the fall, but from the suburban and downstate districts. Because even though we, for the last 2 years, have funded or appropriated for elementary and secondary education, and even though we had categorical grant appropriations, categorical grants are transportation, special ed, and free and reduced lunches, there's not enough money anymore. So much of the money is going for debt service, so much is going for the pension contribution, so much is going to the court-ordered Medicaid and related federal funds, and so much is going for for all the state employees to be paid. There's not enough money to make the categorical payments. School districts like Elgin and St. Charles and others are telling us, Aurora, that without a comprehensive budget that actually has enough money to pay the appropriations, they won't be able to open their schools in the fall.
Thank you, Laurence. Thank you. Okay. I want to get everybody in, and then we'll open this up more. So let's hear the journalist perspective. Amanda Vinicky, you're down in Springfield and that. What do you think is going to happen in the next couple of weeks, and how do you see things right now?
I'm not sure I'm prepared to venture a guess as to what will happen in the next couple of weeks. I do think, however, that this topic is very timely because education is going to be a very key part of that for some of the reasons that Laurence just talked about, including that for the past couple of years, even when everything else wasn't being funded or it was a question, in cases you had municipalities, what have you, 911 call centers, pleading for money and then getting short-term bailouts, you had instead education funded all throughout. From the time that the governor signed that first education funding bill, there was no question about schools. We have heard some legislators now say, hey, maybe we don't do that again. Maybe we try a different tact to try to get a resolution to this years-long budget impasse. And how else are you going to do that? You would do that by not opening schools is one of the very key ways that you would finally see a change in the dynamic. Now, while you hear people talking about that, I do suspect we'll be very hard-pressed to see any lawmaker go and follow through with that. You would have mass chaos with parents that have jobs and nowhere to send their kids because the schools aren't open. Violence is, of course, an issue, and so on. But that is going to be a key fight, and when you look at this timeline, there's obviously the June 30th / July 1st deadline that is crucial, but beyond that, it's when schools open in the fall and when they need to make their decisions. As we're talking about this discussion, I want to say, first of all, of course, thank you for having me back to this venerable institution here at the City Club. But for those of you that are Chicago residents, I'm going to say something that I hope you don't find offensive. It does not come from me, but I think that it is central to point out in that fight, and that is that in the rest of the state, they don't like you much. Not at all. You ain't popular. That's not to say that people don't want to, go see the Sky Deck, maybe go to a Cubs or a Sox game. That's not what I'm saying. It is, however, that when you hear what has passed, Senate Bill 1, and we'll, I'm sure, get into some of the details of that soon enough, but when you hear the governor calling it a bailout, and he's not alone, there are other Republicans throughout the state who are saying that in part because I think many believe it, and in part because it works. Yes, CPS is the state's largest school district. 20% of all students that are in schools in Illinois from kindergarten through high school. But there are a whole lot of others that, as Laurence alluded to, are hurting very badly, don't have money, some of which have less spent per pupil than does Chicago. They are hurting as well. So anything that is either actually a bailout or considered a bailout is something that you're going to be hard-pressed to find legislators from any of those areas to back. And I point this out, again, just because it is central to recognizing that this is politics. Whatever does pass, whatever the governor signs, needs to be something that everybody can be okay with. And so it's walking that fine line of giving Chicago enough that its finances can get back on track, and yet not so much so that other districts feel as if they are the losers. And that is what has kept Illinois from having an education funding bill. We've had how many commissions? I mean, I can't even count. I say 5, but that's probably understated by at least double. We've had however many commissions looking at how to change the formula so that it can be more equitable. But the issue with that has been that you're going to therefore have winners and losers. Politicians don't like that. You can't be a representative that goes home to your district and says, hey, you know that bill that I voted for? You got less money. That's not going to happen. And what you have with Senate Bill 1 is a plan now that, because of the quote unquote, when you hear the term hold harmless tossed about, basically the plan is that no district will suffer. There will be no district that sees its budget cut. And central to that, however, is what exactly does hold harmless mean, particularly for Chicago. So perhaps we can get into those details later. My time is short because I did want to add that while much of the discussion has been and should be focused on Senate Bill 1, there are other education issues that we need to look toward. For example, there are 17 downstate school districts that have sued the state. While Chicago was not successful in its claim that funding is discriminatory, 17 districts, Cahokia, that I believe spends $6,000 per student, significantly less than you do at the $30,000 or so at the New Trier High School. They're part of that lawsuit. We have not seen any hearings in that, but that is something to watch. Also, of course, property taxes are key to education funding, but also going to be key to the gubernatorial race. So that is something very much to watch. The role that charter schools play has been something that is interesting because that's something that Governor Bruce Rauner obviously has supported. That is now baked into the formula so that charter schools will be funded on the same level as other districts. And then also I think you can't forget higher education. That's part of education as well. And right now it is not getting funded at all.
Thank you, Amanda. Bill Daley in the cleanup spot. Bill?
Great, thanks. I had the pleasure of being with Jim Edgar, the first co-chairman of Advance Illinois. And as many people in this room, and I see there's a couple of board members, Luke Collins, Judy Irvin, the fight for reform of the school system has gone on now for many, many years. And now it's moved to the funding piece, finally, the equity, and then the honest sort of state's obligation. And we are there. Let me just say, Amanda, I've been around a rather long time. There is never a piece of legislation that's ever passed Springfield that hasn't been attacked if it sends a dime to Chicago as a bailout for Chicago. Go back to my dad, Rich, the whole thing. So the fact that that's the politics of today, that's been the politics probably since Illinois was founded. But the reality is, you know, this state is troubled in education, not just in Chicago, which it is in obviously difficult shape. As Carole said, though, there has been tremendous progress over the last 10, 15 years. It takes a very long time to move something as deep as difficult situation in the school system. So it's changing. It's doing all of those things that all the reformers, including the governor, when he was not governor, called for. And that's having results. And so that this whole discussion, even as Carole said, the sort of laughter at the question, is there a future? The truth is maybe some of us laughed at it because there's no future for Illinois if this funding situation is not straightened out. I know Representative Harris is here and he's got the obligation as a Republican in suburban Cook County, a difficult situation obviously, but districts like his and around his understand the problem with funding right now and the crisis that we're in statewide. Second of all, in politics, I've spent some time in it also. Bruce Rauner cannot win re-election if he doesn't get a budget right this year, and cannot win re-election if he doesn't make major strides, in my opinion. I don't care who's running against him, on education. He can't just win on beating the hell out of Chicago and thinking that, you know, it worked a long time ago when there was a real political system here that maybe dominated the state more than was justified at the time. But I really believe that. I think if he doesn't get a budget this year and they stumble into the same sort of thing we'd done 2 years ago, I don't know, maybe I'll throw my hat in the ring, because anybody would be. And I said that about Pat Quinn.
We need more Democratic candidates. That's what we need.
I said this, I thought at the time anybody who was running against Pat would win. Not all because of his fault, but I would say right now that, and he'd probably even have trouble in a primary if they don't get a budget this year.
Mr. Daley, if you're going to run, we have what's called the green rule here.
I'm only joking.
You must get at least 5% in a poll before you'll be invited back to our gubernatorial debate panel, so think about that. Okay. Carole, you wanted to respond.
Yeah, I really wanted to respond to this notion of a Chicago bailout, but Bill did it well. I do want to note that Senate Bill 1, it does hold school districts harmless. 268 of the districts would actually see increased funding. And there is an issue with the way the state funds education, or K through 12 education, that always gets glossed over. And that is, the Chicago Public Schools are the only school district in the state responsible for their own teacher's pension. This year, the pension payment for the Chicago Public Schools is $721 million. $721 million. The state will put in roughly $4 billion into the teacher's retirement system pension for every other school district in the state. So if the state picked up the CPS pension, you'd be talking about a school district that wasn't running deficit, but would be roughly balanced. And so, and here's the other thing, and I've said this a lot if anyone's heard me talk. I live in the city of Chicago. I own property in the city of Chicago. As a property owner in the city of Chicago, my property taxes go to pay the Chicago Public School teachers' pension. As a person who works in the state of Illinois, my income taxes go to pay the teachers' pension for every other school district in the state. How is that fair?
And that is,
Okay.
Let me just, I want to add one
Bill?
more thing. You know, there's a misconception often that somehow the teachers' pensions are so exorbitant. The truth of the matter is they're basically at the same par with the rest of the teachers who are in the state system that the state pays for. So this idea that somehow all these retirees from CPS are becoming millionaires in Florida or something is just ridiculous.
I was just going to add in terms of the pension notion in Senate Bill 1, because I think that is central to how it can be categorized as a quote-unquote bailout. I'm obviously a journalist. I'm not saying I come down on either side of this. Just regardless, that is very much a part of when you hear it characterized as a quote-unquote bailout. It is because of that, and also there's the question of the Chicago block grant. It's $250 million that Chicago gets above and beyond what it would get if it were just using the same formula and calculation that other schools got.
Because the
And
formula
yet,
is
there's no-
inequitable. Because the formula, if you just take the formula funding portion of school funding, Chicago Public Schools would get roughly 14% of the funding. They make up roughly 20% of the children. So the block grant was developed to normalize that formula. But I'll say this, you can have your $250 million of block grants back
Pay our pension.
if you just pay the pension.
And that is,
Whoa. Ladies, while you're duking it out,
I have no.
can we have Laurence chime in on that? Because I'm sure he has an interesting view on the issue
I think
that,
what everyone at this table is pointing out is that pensions drive so much of what's going on in financing for our state and for our Chicago Public Schools. And it was all created with great complicity of the state of Illinois, right? The Chicago Public School pension crisis was created as a result of state law that allowed for the takeover, or when Mayor Daley, Bill's brother, agreed to take over the Chicago Public Schools directly. One of the parts of the legislation was that as long as the pensions for Chicago teachers was 90% funded, we wouldn't make contributions. That'll freed up money in the property tax levy for other things. What has happened in Illinois is other things have been used for all of our tax receipts, not our pensions. We have a Supreme Court that has said that you're very limited, unlike other states' Supreme Courts, in terms of what you can do to reduce that unfunded liability. There are still things that could be done, but what you're hearing about in Springfield when they're saying we're not going to provide for the Chicago Public School pensions, or we shouldn't have to, is really, really disappointing for the people who understand the facts. We don't need a separate Chicago teachers pension fund. The state should take it over. It should have never created a separate one. If you merge the Chicago teachers pension fund into the state, downstate and suburban teachers pension fund, a lot of the pressures of the unfunded liability that is driving a lot of the crisis in Chicago Public Schools would go away. who's best able, the largest government with the largest tax base, to make up for decades of underfunding of both Chicago Public Schools and the state.
Right now, what you have in Springfield with the negotiations, so you have Senate Bill 1 that passed but is not able, the governor isn't able to actually act on it because there's a motion to reconsider. Basically, it's on hold while they fight this all out. Then Republicans came out with their new plan. In this new plan, it does take on the cost for CPS normal pension costs, so they cover that $215 million, but not the $720. They're not taking on the legacy, they're not taking on the full portion. The Republicans have said, we'll agree to that, but the fight now seems to be over this hold harmless. And what does that mean? Does it mean that every school, and this is what Democrats passed, is held harmless from where it is now? You're never going to lose money. We will have this new formula that makes everything more equitable. There are adequacy targets. You measure what a school district is able to afford, and then those students, do they have a population that's full of special needs kids, English as a second language kids, what have you. Take those into account, but that's only with new money. So the hold harmless is the big question, and the central fight now seems to be, well, one of, but in terms of the education, there's plenty of fights going on, but this one is, do you say hold harmless is all schools right there, or do you say, all right, we're gonna freeze, but Republicans believe that because of this block grant, Chicago was ahead when they were playing this game of freeze tag, and you can't just stay there, we're gonna pull you back, at least after a couple of years. That's what Republicans have on the table now, is something that holds harmless with that block grant initially, but then pulls back and says, instead of moving to that hold harmless by district level, we're gonna go per pupil. And that's difficult for Chicago because it's seeing enrollment declines, which means Chicago will see less. So those are some of the things to look for that are part of the more nuanced discussion, but the details that this has really gotten to, as by and large you actually do have, finally, a formula that the basics of which both parties agree on. Again,
What about the governor?
But don't be confused but don't be confused. If you take the pension question off, which is what most of the debate around the hold harmless is done, they push the pension issue to the side. The notion that all of a sudden just covering normal costs, when both the teachers' retirement system and the Chicago Public School Teachers Fund have unfunded liability, to say, well, we're only going to address the normal costs because we didn't contribute to the problem of the unfunded liability, it's just fiction. And so what they're saying is like, okay, we'll pick up the normal costs, but that $500 million of unfunded liability, CPS, you're on your own. Other school districts, yeah, we got this, but CPS, you're on your own. Either you're going to fairly fund education, which includes the costs of the people who provide the education, the teachers, for every school district, or you're not. And the rest of it is just fiction, and it's just political banter. It is not a real discourse about how do we fairly and adequately fund education in the state.
And pensions are complicated on top of it, because if you really think about it, that's part of the equity issue as well. If you have the state picking up the tab for teachers' pensions, their retirement, the state's picking up a greater portion of the tab in districts that pay their teachers more and have more teachers. So you have the wealthy school districts getting a bigger portion of the state's money, in essence, by the state, no matter what, we're obligated to pick up that pension tab. There was the notion of a cost shift. Okay, not just Chicago picking up the retirement costs for its employees, but also every other school district doing the same. That has largely been brushed aside because I think that is, again, politically very difficult for any legislator to vote for, particularly when you have cries for a property tax freeze.
Now, we talked about agreement by the Republicans on the Senate Bill 1 and that, and supposedly there was an arrangement earlier in the legislative session between Senator Cullerton, Senator Radonio and that, and allegedly the governor put a kibosh on that. What about on this education approach? Do we know where he is?
Well, his Secretary of Education said he agrees with 90% of the SB 1. And so it seems to me, if you can get 90% of what you want, that's pretty good. 100%.
But does he understand compromise?
100% is
question.
in the next life, if you believe in the next life. I haven't seen it. I mean, if he does, it's a big surprise to me.
That's part of why they're holding on to it. Democrats say they're holding on to it so that the governor can think about it. And maybe he'll come around. And that is part of this compromise. What Republicans, that's what when I was talking about, for example, Senator Barrickman has really been the leader from Republicans on this education funding formula proposal. They have this new package. Republicans are calling it a compromise. Democrats are like, hey, wait a second. Compromise means you talk to us, so you can't just unveil something and call it that. But it is based off of part of what Democrats had wanted. And so it's that hold harmless is one of the kind of key fights that now is left. And supposedly then the governor has said he would go along with Senate Bill 1 and its prime tenets of redoing the formula with the adequacy. Something to point out there, though, is that, again, that's only if you get new money. Changing the formula makes really no difference. If you had a hold harmless and you put money into the system at what it is now, you need the at least $215 million that Chicago is going to get, plus I believe it's another $350 million to parse out between all the other school districts. And of course, we all know the state doesn't have a ton of money right now, period. You have districts, as Laurence noted, Elgin has really been very public about it, but that say, you're so behind on paying us? Sure, supposedly schools got a $700 million increase this year, but that doesn't mean squat because they're waiting on about $1 billion for all of those mandated categoricals that the state just doesn't have money in its bank account to pay out. So it's like a fake raise.
Laurence, you wanted to comment?
No, I would just, Amanda mentioned that the state doesn't have a lot of money right now. The state's not going to have a lot of money for a long time. I don't care how big the tax increase is that is going to be proposed, or whether it's 4.999 so that we can stay under 5%, or it's 5.25, which is what the Civic Federation said. We are burning money right now at the state of Illinois. The comptroller said $800 million this year, just the prompt penalty payments for the unpaid bills of the state of Illinois. You could take $800 million and light it on fire on LaSalle Street for the benefit that all of us and the taxpayers of Illinois got for that $800 million in penalties. It is incredible to every other state or anyone who looks at it from the outside that we are operating and continuing to operate. It was mentioned higher education. We are crushing our future by not funding higher education, by allowing our sectorial colleges or universities to basically wither. And it's not just the public institutions. Because we're not funding the monetary assistance program, because we're sending a message to our high school graduates that they should look elsewhere, and all of the other states surrounding us need the population of our students, we're losing really the future of the state of Illinois the longer we keep this budget crisis, lack of willingness to compromise on the table.
Now, why do you think then the public isn't more outraged? Because we see Chicago State, danger of closing. Northeastern Illinois, danger of closing. Faculty, staff have been laid off. UI in Springfield, Western, Eastern, UI in Champaign, and so on. All of these schools, and as you just mentioned, this is so important to the future, the economic engine and growth in this state. Why aren't people more upset?
Because they're not feeling it, right? The people that are at most vulnerable, that rely on state services, the mentally ill, the elderly, that rely on Meals on Wheels, they're feeling it. They're not getting their services. But the vast majority of Illinoisans, and Chicagoans included, are not seeing the immediate crisis affect them. We're still operating, our schools. We're still maintaining our prisons. We're paying all the state employees. That's about to end if we don't have a budget, if we slip. And the state has been told by the rating agencies that if they don't have a budget by the end of this month, they can look forward to another downgrade. That means the state of Illinois will be the first state in the union to be junk bond as an entity. And that's expensive, very expensive, but that's not the bigger problem. Once you go down to non-investment grade or junk bond, you're not coming out of it anytime soon. The investors are going to want more assurances. The rating agencies are going to want a lot more evidence that the state is capable of managing its obligations. They waited a long time because nobody believed that the state of Illinois would do this. And now we have 3 years of proof that the state of Illinois will do this. They will let our higher education, our mental health services, our most vulnerable, hang in the balance while we argue over the politics of whether we should have a budget or not.
Thank you. Bill Daley.
Yeah, just double on what Laurence said. The impact to go to junk bond status is no one's ever seen it. It would be, it would take, generally, talk about bankruptcy, you're basically, at that point, you are bankrupt. You could call it what you want. Maybe you don't have a process to formally go through bankruptcy, but for all practical purposes, you are. And then many investors in the paper of Illinois have to get out of it because they can't hold junk bonds in their portfolios, so they have to get out. And who comes in? The hedge funds to buy this paper. And then push and push and push to get paid. And they step forward in line for repayment whenever that happens. So, you know, we're 2 weeks away from that possibility, and how we could even have that on the horizon, much less it'll only be 2 weeks away, is just dumbfounded. I mean, if that happens, shut off the lights and good luck to you.
Now, I'm not at all advocating that they allow the state to go to junk, but as a representative of an issuer that has one rating that is non-investment grade, I would say that how the state manages once and if they are put in investment grade will have a lot to do, because, you know, when we talk to investors, they all say that they've never seen this and that they don't really expect that the state will allow itself to stay, you know, without paying bills. And so they still have a belief that eventually the state's going to work its way out of it. And so I don't believe that the state being put into junk will necessarily create like this market panic right away. But I do believe that a prolonged period without a budget, without any action, will have investors. I mean, Laurence noted that if you just look at the debt service of issuers in the state, so before this last round of debt downgrades, the penalty that issuers collectively in the state were paying was about $930 million. So $930 million more in debt service because of what's known as the Illinois penalty for all issuers in the state, whether they were rated AAA or AA. Since this last downgrade, that's up to about $1.2 billion. If the state goes to non-investment grade, investors estimate that that'll be about $1.7 billion. So that $800 million that Laurence was talking about just lighting up in, on LaSalle Street, it's really more like $2.5 billion that we're just lighting up because of lack of a budget.
Well, and think about right there, that's money, that's Chicago's pension payment. That is the money that you could see above what schools are funded now and instead put into this new formula. I mean, all of that is right there. That's what it instead is going toward. Nothing, and, well, debt, bankers.
Okay, we've got a few questions here, so in our remaining time, and if you have any questions, please hold them up, and members of our staff will come around and pick them up. So if you have any questions, you know, please get them up here to me. Caitlin, I see there's one over here.
It's timely, and I think really there's not much time left. And
The first question, it's not anything that we've talked about really, but it's an important question. It's from City Club member Jim Turman. What is the panel's view on an elected school board? Who would like to begin?
What the hell, I'll start.
Mr. Daley. You can see how eager they are to jump on that question.
I think that we're at a stage where some elected school board probably should be done. I think the problems, the issues, I think my own sort of plan would be that, you know, there'd be 5 members elected citywide through districts that would be kind of piled on top of each other so they'd cross the city and you wouldn't have, you know, so many whites or blacks or blah, 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 and try to do that. And then have the mayor have, say, 3 appointments so that you couldn't pass anything without 5 votes, so the mayor's got skin in the game. This idea of taking this mayor out of the game, to me, is, maybe it's good for a mayor in some ways. But remember, Rich wanted to get in the game because he heard from business saying, if you don't straighten this thing out, and it wouldn't have happened if there wasn't a Republican legislature, let's be honest. If you don't straighten this out, we're out of here. And, you know, every other mayor, including my dad, had the ability to at least say, well, it's a separate entity over there, school board. So the mayor's got to have skin in the game or else, and if you go to the, you know, the proposal that I think is out there is the members wouldn't be paid. Okay, that's fine. That means they're working for someone, whether it's a union or a company or someone who has an interest in that. And that seems to me a little weird, that you're going to have these people do this big job and then not pay them and think that there's not going to be some backer.
So-
And we're going to spend more money and raise more money for politicians to run the school system. Great.
I'll just quickly add, I obviously have no opinion on whether or not there should be one, but what you have had happen in Springfield is the House did pass an elected school board bill, so did the Senate, but now it's changed, so it has to go back for the House, isn't going to the governor's desk yet. I think there is a possibility that that could be, just so that you have legislators, particularly those from Chicago, say, hey, look, I voted for it, even if there is no chance of it actually becoming law. Or Democrats may, as well as Republicans, it was a broad support, send it to the governor. The governor, WTTW, had an interview with him just after the regular session adjourned, and we asked him about that. And what Rauner said was that he supports the notion, because remember, he's all about local control, but he says that he doesn't like it for basically what you talked about. He thinks that there are not the protections that there need to be, and what he means by that is that he is not wanting there to be a school board that is all funded by donors that then they're making decisions about, AKA unions. So that's where the governor is on it, if it in fact does get to his desk.
I think the evidence is pretty split on whether appointed or elected school boards have a greater tendency for financial stability, for being more responsive. Really, most of the cities that would be comparable, New York, Boston, all have appointed members. Sometimes they're appointed from someone else besides the mayor. It can be appointed by, commissioners. The big school boards that are elected, LA, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis, it's uneven in terms of how they're financially are doing. What it really gets to, and I think Bill makes a really good point, it was a problem when it was anyone but the mayor who was directly accountable for the schools, right? In terms of getting the political will, getting the attention of the public. We have all the units of government we need in Illinois, and then some. Probably an extra 3,000 more than we need. But, so it's not a panacea. It is in my opinion, you could probably go to a hybrid and have some benefits to that. We certainly want to make it more responsive. The Chicago Public Schools has a lot of room to grow in terms of its transparency, in terms of its confidence in sharing with the public what its plans are from the Civic Federation standpoint. But we do not see the direct election of school board members until we can elect some school board member who could capture this room's attention and explain the school aid formula to us and how they would change it. That would be one where you would want to get behind them.
Solves that problem.
The only
Well,
thing
that
I would
dovetails
say-
into, I'm sorry,
The only thing I
Carole.
would say about elected school board is that it doesn't change the funding situation. And before you go to an elected school board, you better know that you've got the funding done correctly, because I think that people don't appreciate how much support, indirect or direct, Chicago Public Schools receives from the city, and that's because of the mayor's involvement. And if you go to an elected school board, you better make sure that the funding formula works, because I think it would change the resources.
We have a question here from Stephanie, no last name. So Stephanie, she's with Mom and Baby. How much money does CPS spend per pupil, and is it equal across all schools in Chicago, or is there a separate formula for each neighborhood?
So the schools right now do what's known as student-based or school-based budgeting. So the dollars follow the student. So it is equal among all students, regardless of what school they go to. Some schools do other fundraising. Some schools the principals, the power of the budget is with the principals, so they determine how they're going to staff their classes. This Chicago Public Schools has metrics that they want in terms of class size, but a lot of the autonomy of how they distribute the dollars is held with the principal, because we do school-based budgeting, so the dollar follows the student. The actual, I'm looking at Ron, I don't know off the top of my head the amount per. So approximately 4,000 per student.
Okay. This is from Will Davis with Governor State. Will, where are you? Okay. Here's his question. Speaking of formulas, public universities are on a 1996 formula. Do you believe an updated formula will be considered?
So the Civic Federation is on record of advocating, updating all of our formulas on a regular basis, waiting 25 or more years to see if things have changed before you decide to change something is not a strategy of a well-run government. So yes, they should definitely be updated. But again, I have to say, until there's a budget, there's no room, there's no air in the room to look at formulas. Because changing things takes more effort than going with the status quo. They should sunset lots of different formulas. The school aid formula is a perfect example. It's been easier all this time to just go with it rather than try to do it. And it's very expensive as a result.
And at this point, I think any district, university just wants a budget at this point in time. Forget about the change. I mean, it's not just the energy in the room that the people making the decisions have for it. It's the capacity to plan. It's thinking, all right, are we actually going to get the millions of dollars that we expect, or are we going to get squat? Because that is what it has been thus far. So any formula at this point, as long as they use it, is what you're going to have universities and schools wanting.
I think Amanda and Laurence are absolutely right. But when you look at I think the Senate bill that passed cut aid to universities by 10%, a overwhelmingly Democratic body. So I think it got to a point where people said, oh, whatever, just get it done. And they put up with a 10% cut, and nobody really complained, which is crazy, but it just tells you what a terrible situation we're in.
Carole, do you want to chime in?
I just would add one thing. It's an example of we're out of money, right? I mean, that the universities have been very ill-served by their previously going along with the notion that somehow the state was going to come up with enough money to fund its pensions and other obligations, and they would get taken care of. Now the music has stopped. We're out of money. They're not getting a lot more money. We have needed higher education reform and probably consolidation based on the population, but this was absolutely the worst and most expensive way to do it. We're starving all of our children to find out which one's going to be the strongest. It doesn't make any sense.
Now, speaking of revenues and potential new money, there's a question here from Kate Nicolay about some new revenue sources. And is there any seriousness to the consideration of legalizing marijuana as a way of raising revenue? Colorado seems to be awash in all this money. California will come on board in just a couple of months. Anything happening in Illinois?
It appears a lot of people are smoking it, but I don't know that.
You know what? I think we should give it to the legislators for free. And then maybe they get something done, or at least get along.
The important thing to keep in mind, and you want to look at Colorado, right? It's not generating billions of dollars to Colorado. It's not generating $500 million to Colorado. It's generating, after the expenses and the enforcement, a couple of $100 million, right? About the same value as the Thompson Center is. That's not going to be a panacea for the state of Illinois either, if they're successful in selling the Thompson Center. It is these easy answers that are very attractive to complicated problems that are often wrong and are easier for people to focus their attention. One of the big things right now, from a political standpoint, which wasn't mentioned, What's one of the big funders of education in Illinois? You all know it, the lottery, right? The other states are saying, no thanks, Illinois, we don't want to be partners with you if you don't promise to pay off your lottery people, because it breaks the dream. We're not going to be in Mega Millions, we're not going to be in Powerball. That's going to take money right out of the state, a couple of $100 more million that we can ill afford.
Even the advocates of legalizing marijuana say, not this year, it's going to be a couple of years. So yes, I think at some point Illinois will go there, but that is certainly not part of any revenue package that is part of current talks to get Illinois back to a budget standpoint. So not this year.
Remember,
time for-
gambling was going to solve all our problems, too.
Carol?
No.
Okay, time for one last question, what we call our quick answer round. We started off by asking, is there a future for education funding in Illinois? So could each of you very quickly tell us if there is after our discussion here today? Who wants to begin?
I'll start.
Laurence.
Yes, there's definitely a future. There's a future for everyone, in spite of all the financially terrible news and how expensive it is going to be for the state once it gets its act together. The state's not going anywhere, right? The U.S. government is not going to change the bankruptcy laws on behalf of Illinois to allow it to file for bankruptcy. So the sooner we can get around to the notion that we're going to have to pay our obligations, and it's a lot cheaper to pay them early than later, the better we'll all be. But yes, education funding will be part of it.
Okay, Amanda?
Yes, of course, there most certainly is. And I think despite all of this talk and despite all of the hardship, schools are better positioned than a whole lot of other sectors of Illinois society. When you look to social services, universities and such, they've been better placed and they are better positioned going forward to either perhaps go into chaos that actually may bring a budget resolution to fruition. Instead, I think the opposite is true. You'll see some sort of school funding pass before perhaps anything else. It is just a matter of, will it be based on this new formula that is getting so much attention, and what role or what world of hurt are certain districts going to be in if that is coupled with a property tax freeze, something that is very, very popular right now heading into the 2018 elections.
Thank you. Mr. Daley?
Yeah, I do believe there's a future. I think SB 1, quite frankly, moves the ball a long way. And as we all know, if the legislature deals with something as dramatic as that, then we'll deal with it again for a very long time. So I think there is. And at the same time, again, you are seeing progress with the kids, not just in Chicago public schools, but in other parts of the state, in real reform that's taken place with the Board of Ed and the fights that took place during Governor Quinn's tenure for reform. So there's progress being made. It'd be so stupid to blow this thing up at this stage.
And Carole?
I think I agree with what Bill is saying, but I'll finish the way I started, which is it's all of our responsibility to make sure that there is a future for education in Illinois, and it's not a small issue. And we all ask why there isn't more outrage for 3 years without a budget. And I say that the future of education funding in Illinois is not just the problem of the General Assembly and the governor. It's all of our problems, and we need to engage, and we need to advocate, and we need to hold our electeds, all of our electeds, accountable for the travesty that has gone on for the last 3 years.
Thank you. Everybody, let's give our panelists a big round of applause.